Hey guys, tonight we step into the dangerously elegant world of Victorian fashion, an era where looking sophisticated often mattered more than basic survival. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Victorian society became hopelessly obsessed with the colour green during the 19th century. Not a calm, respectable green. They wanted the brightest emerald shade imaginable. The kind of green that practically screamed across the ballroom like an aristocrat demanding more soup from a terrified servant. If your dress glowed faintly beneath candlelight like an enchanted swamp, then you were considered the height of sophistication. The slight drawback was that the dye contained arsenic. Chemists had developed pigments called Scheele's green and Paris green using arsenic compounds, and manufacturers immediately fell in love with them. The colour looked rich, luxurious and expensive, which, in Victorian society, usually mattered far more than whether it could quietly destroy your internal organs over time. Soon the dye spread everywhere. Dresses, gloves, ribbons, shoes, artificial flowers, wallpaper, children's toys. At some point, an entire civilization collectively looked at poison and thought, this would really brighten up the dining room. Women proudly wore these gowns to crowded dances and elegant dinner parties, unaware that tiny arsenic particles were rubbing onto their skin and floating invisibly through the air. Heat and sweat made matters even worse. Warm ballrooms slowly released toxic fumes from the fabric itself, meaning many Victorian social events were essentially glamorous chemistry accidents accompanied by piano music. The symptoms arrived gradually: headaches, nausea, fatigue, hair loss, skin lesions, difficulty breathing. Some women developed painful sores wherever the fabric touched their bodies. Others became chronically ill without understanding why. Victorian doctors, meanwhile, remained committed to their favourite medical hobby: confidently misunderstanding women. A woman could be visibly collapsing from arsenic poisoning, and some doctor with impressive sideburns would still diagnose her with nervous sensitivity before recommending less reading and perhaps a relaxing walk outside, preferably not near the toxic wallpaper. The workers producing these fashionable items suffered even more horribly. Young factory employees spent entire days handling arsenic pigments with little protection. Artificial flower makers often dipped decorations directly into poisonous dyes using their bare hands. Many developed open sores, tremors, damaged lungs, and severe long-term illnesses. But the flowers looked delightful on hats, so industry marched onward with admirable optimism. Newspapers occasionally warned the public. Scientists published alarming reports. Satirical cartoons showed skeletons dressed elegantly in glowing green gowns. Yet society largely ignored the danger because the dresses remained fashionable. Victorian culture operated on a very simple principle. If something looked beautiful enough, death became more of a background detail. And honestly, the most Victorian part of all this was the attitude surrounding pale skin. Arsenic poisoning often made women appear weak, delicate and ghostly, which unfortunately happened to align perfectly with Victorian beauty standards. So in some cases, the poison was technically improving the look people were aiming for. Humanity truly has an extraordinary ability to mistake medical emergencies for fashion trends. If Victorian fashion had a single greatest enemy, it was probably the human ribcage. Corsets became one of the defining symbols of Victorian beauty, promising women the perfect hourglass figure through the ancient and highly scientific method of squeezing the body until nature surrendered completely. A tiny waist represented discipline, femininity, elegance, and social status. It also represented difficulty breathing, chronic pain, and organs quietly begging for mercy, somewhere beneath layers of whalebone and fabric. At first, corsets were not always extreme. Many women wore them with relatively moderate tightness for posture and support. But as fashion evolved, so did society's obsession with impossibly narrow waists. Tight lacing became increasingly popular among upper-class women competing to achieve measurements that sounded less like anatomy and more like the circumference of a decorative lamp. Some women trained their waists for years, tightening corsets gradually over time until their bodies physically adapted. Ribs compressed inward, Internal organs shifted position. The stomach, liver, and intestines all squeezed together like nervous passengers trying to survive a crowded carriage ride through London. Breathing became shallow and difficult. Many women could not properly expand their lungs while wearing tightly laced corsets, especially during dances or physical activity. Fainting became incredibly common. Victorian novels romanticized these dramatic collapses as signs of feminine delicacy, when in reality many women were simply experiencing temporary oxygen shortages in public. Nothing says elegance quite like losing consciousness beside the punch bowl. Doctors occasionally warned against excessive corset use, especially when young girls began wearing them during adolescence while their skeletons were still developing. Some physicians reported deformed rib cages and weakened muscles in patients who had worn tight corsets for years. Others described digestive problems so severe that eating large meals became nearly impossible. Ironically, Victorian society then praised women for eating very little, interpreting it as refined self-control rather than the obvious consequence of having your stomach compressed into the approximate shape of a folded letter. The materials themselves could also be dangerous. Many corsets used rigid whalebone or steel supports that dug painfully into the body. Cheaply made corsets sometimes snapped unexpectedly, causing cuts or bruising. Imagine quietly attending an opera before your undergarments suddenly attempt a small mechanical uprising beneath your clothing. And despite all of this suffering, corsets remained deeply admired. Fashion magazines praised tiny waists relentlessly. Men admired them. Women competed over them. Society treated physical discomfort as proof of refinement, as though agony itself were an accessory. The Victorians truly mastered the art of turning slow physical damage into a status symbol. By the middle of the 19th century, Victorian dresses had expanded to truly unreasonable dimensions. Fashionable women wore enormous hoop skirts called crinolines, massive cage-like structures made from steel hoops and layers of fabric designed to make the wearer appear grand, elegant, and wealthy. In practice, many women looked like beautifully decorated sailing ships attempting to navigate narrow hallways. Crinolines became wildly popular because they created the illusion of a tiny waist while adding dramatic volume to the skirt. The larger the dress, the more fashionable the woman appeared. Society had essentially decided that women should occupy the maximum amount of physical space possible, while simultaneously being expected to move gracefully and never inconvenience anyone. This plan quickly encountered several problems. For starters, these dresses were enormous. Women struggled to fit through doors, climb into carriages, or sit down without carefully calculating fabric distribution like military engineers planning a siege. Wind became a constant enemy. Entire skirts occasionally lifted or twisted unexpectedly in public, transforming elegant walks into desperate battles against physics. But the greatest danger was fire. Victorian homes relied heavily on candles, fireplaces, gas lamps, and open stoves. Crinolines contained huge amounts of lightweight, highly flammable fabric suspended around the body, like a portable curtain surrounding a human candle wick. One accidental brush against an open flame could ignite the dress almost instantly. And it happened constantly. Thousands of women reportedly died in crinoline fires during the 19th century. Newspapers regularly published horrifying stories of women catching fire while standing too close to fireplaces or candles. Once ignited, the flames spread rapidly through the fabric, trapping heat beneath the skirt and surrounding the body in seconds. Some women died before help could even reach them. Others survived with devastating burns. In crowded homes or theatres, panic spread quickly because burning crinolines had an unfortunate tendency to become fast-moving infernos, crashing through furniture while screaming. Even famous figures were not spared. The half-sisters of author Oscar Wilde reportedly died after their dresses caught fire during a party. Ballerinas and actresses faced constant danger on candlelit stages surrounded by fabric costumes and open flames. Victorian entertainment occasionally carried the same safety standards as storing fireworks inside a bakery. And yet, despite all the deaths, crinolines remained fashionable for years. Fashion magazines continued praising them. Dressmakers kept producing them. Society simply accepted occasional combustion as part of elegance. Women were expected to move carefully, avoid flames, and somehow survive while wearing what amounted to several meters of decorative kindling. The Victorians truly possessed unmatched confidence in humanity's ability to coexist peacefully with fire while wrapped entirely in curtains. Victorian beauty standards revolved around one central goal: looking as pale as humanly possible without technically being declared deceased. Pale skin represented wealth and refinement because it suggested you did not work outdoors. If you had a healthy tan, society immediately assumed you spent time doing manual labour, which horrified the upper classes almost as much as practical shoes. To achieve this fashionable ghost-like appearance, many women covered their faces with powders and creams containing lead, mercury, and other substances that modern science now classifies somewhere between dangerous and absolutely not. Lead-based face powder became especially popular because it created a smooth white complexion that hid blemishes and gave the skin a delicate porcelain appearance. Unfortunately, lead also happened to be extremely poisonous. Over time, these cosmetics caused headaches, tremors, hair loss, tooth decay, skin damage, and severe long-term health problems. Ironically, the makeup often destroyed the skin it was supposed to improve. Women developed sores, discoloration, and premature aging from constant use. Naturally, the solution was not to stop using toxic makeup. The solution was to apply even more toxic makeup to cover the damage caused by the previous toxic makeup. Victorian cosmetics operated with the same logic as setting your kitchen on fire to stay warm during winter. Some beauty products also contained mercury, which slowly poisoned users through repeated exposure. Mercury damaged the nervous system and caused emotional instability, memory problems, and trembling hands. But at least the complexion looked wonderfully refined while the nervous system quietly collapsed behind the scenes. Beauty routines themselves could be exhausting. Women applied layers of powder, creams, rouges, and perfumes daily, often in poorly ventilated rooms lit by candles or gas lamps. The combination of chemical fumes and heavy cosmetics sometimes caused dizziness or breathing problems. A Victorian dressing table occasionally resembled a small alchemist's laboratory, run by someone deeply committed to making questionable decisions. Even advertisements promoted these dangerous products aggressively. Companies promised eternal youth, flawless beauty, and radiant skin with astonishing confidence. There was very little regulation, meaning almost anyone could mix suspicious chemicals into a jar and market it as a miracle treatment. Victorian consumers trusted these products with the same optimism medieval peasants probably showed toward mysterious travelling doctors selling healing soup from a wagon. And perhaps the strangest part was that the ideal Victorian woman was expected to appear weak, pale, and slightly exhausted at all times. The symptoms of slow poisoning actually aligned perfectly with fashionable beauty standards. So while modern people spend fortunes trying to look healthy and energetic, the Victorians proudly poisoned themselves until they resembled elegant Victorian ghosts, wandering politely through candle-lit hallways. Victorian society feared aging with extraordinary intensity, especially when it came to hair. Grey hair suggested decline, weakness, and the horrifying possibility that time continued moving forward regardless of social status. Naturally, this led to an explosion of hair dyes, tonics, oils, and treatments created by people whose scientific qualifications often appeared to consist entirely of owning a moustache and several glass bottles. Many Victorian hair dyes contained lead nitrate, silver compounds, sulfur, ammonia, and other chemicals that modern people would hesitate to pour directly onto industrial machinery, let alone their scalps. Dark hair was especially fashionable, so women and men alike applied these mixtures regularly in hopes of preserving youthful appearances. Advertisements promised miraculous transformations. Restore your natural colour. Revive your beauty. Appear 20 years younger. Victorian marketing had already mastered the timeless business strategy of convincing insecure people to rub poison onto themselves for confidence. Some dyes worked gradually, staining the hair darker over repeated use. Others reacted unpredictably with heat, sweat, or sunlight. Certain mixtures left the hair brittle and weak. Some burned the scalp badly enough to cause blistering or permanent hair loss, which admittedly complicated the goal of appearing youthful. Imagine trying to preserve your hair by accidentally destroying it entirely. Humanity has always been impressively committed to irony. Men also participated enthusiastically in these dangerous grooming rituals, Victorian gentlemen carefully dyed beards and moustaches to maintain a distinguished appearance. Unfortunately, low-quality dyes sometimes produce bizarre shades rather than natural colours. A respectable businessman hoping for rich dark brown facial hair could occasionally emerge looking faintly blue under sunlight, like an emotionally exhausted raven. Hair tonics were equally questionable. Many contained alcohol, oils, perfumes, or chemical stimulants marketed as cures for baldness. Some products claimed to strengthen hair growth through invigorating scalp treatments, which often translated into aggressively irritating the skin until something happened. Victorians truly believed that if a product burned painfully enough, it was probably working. Barbershops and salons offered little protection from contamination either. Brushes, combs and tools were reused constantly without proper sanitation. Skin infections spread easily. Certain hair products attracted lice or caused severe allergic reactions. Yet appearance remained everything. So people continued applying these mixtures daily, while pretending the faint chemical smell surrounding them was perfectly normal. And perhaps most impressively, many of these dangerous products remained popular even after obvious side effects appeared. If someone's scalp started peeling dramatically after using a hair tonic, society rarely blamed the tonic itself. The victim simply had sensitive skin. Victorian beauty culture had an extraordinary ability to reinterpret chemical injuries as personal weaknesses. Victorian fashion demanded hats for nearly every social occasion. Top hats, riding hats, morning hats, walking hats, dinner hats. Society had somehow concluded that the human head required a different architectural structure, depending on the time of day and level of emotional suffering. Behind many of these elegant hats stood a deeply unpleasant industry powered by mercury. Hat makers used mercury nitrate during the production of felt hats, particularly those made from beaver fur. The chemical helped separate and soften the fur fibres, creating the smooth material fashionable gentlemen loved wearing while discussing the British Empire and pretending colonialism was going wonderfully for everyone involved. The process exposed workers to toxic mercury fumes day after day inside poorly ventilated workshops. At first, symptoms seemed minor: trembling hands, fatigue, irritability. But long-term exposure caused devastating neurological damage. Workers developed slurred speech, memory loss, hallucinations, paranoia, emotional instability, and uncontrollable shaking. Some became so mentally and physically impaired that they struggled to perform basic tasks. This condition became widely associated with hat makers, giving rise to the phrase, "mad as a hatter." Yes, one of literature's most famous eccentric characters was partially inspired by real workers slowly suffering chemical brain damage while manufacturing stylish accessories for wealthy customers. Victorian society truly had an extraordinary ability to transform industrial poisoning into whimsical vocabulary. Inside these workshops, mercury fumes coated the air constantly. Workers inhaled toxins for hours while handling boiling chemicals with minimal protection. Many developed a condition called hatter's shakes, where their hands trembled uncontrollably, which unfortunately is not ideal when your profession involves precise cutting and sewing near sharp tools. Some workers became deeply depressed or emotionally unstable. Others experienced sudden bursts of anger or confusion. Entire workshops slowly descended into neurological chaos, while continuing to produce elegant hats for upper-class customers who remained blissfully unaware that their fashionable top hat came with a side order of industrial tragedy. And even when people began understanding the connection between mercury and madness, the industry changed slowly. Hat production remained profitable, and profits have historically possessed remarkable healing powers when it comes to public concern. Meanwhile, fashionable gentlemen proudly wore these hats everywhere. Politicians wore them. Bankers wore them. Funeral attendees wore them. Society treated hats as symbols of refinement, while the workers making them quietly sacrificed their nervous systems in the background. There is something uniquely Victorian about this entire arrangement. An empire obsessed with manners and elegance, built partly upon men inhaling toxic metal vapours until they started hallucinating beside piles of beaver fur. Still, at least the hats looked excellent in photographs. Victorian footwear was designed according to one very simple principle. If the shoes were comfortable, they were probably unfashionable. For women especially, shoes became less about walking and more about surviving social expectations with minimal visible limping. Fashionable Victorian boots were often narrow, stiff, poorly ventilated, and constructed with all the kindness of a medieval punishment device. Tiny pointed toes squeezed the feet unnaturally, while high heels forced women into awkward postures that slowly damaged joints and muscles over time. The ideal Victorian woman was expected to glide gracefully through society. In reality, many were carefully hobbling across cobblestone streets while pretending their toes were not actively negotiating surrender. Shoes frequently caused bunions, deformed toes, chronic pain, and balance problems. Some women could barely walk long distances without assistance. But because long dresses covered the feet almost entirely, practicality became irrelevant. Nobody could see the shoes clearly anyway. Their purpose was not comfort. Their purpose was symbolic suffering. Victorian fashion truly loved the idea that pain demonstrated refinement. Poorly made boots also caused cuts and infections. Tight leather rubbed constantly against the skin, especially during damp weather. Since medical care remained inconsistent and antibiotics did not yet exist, even minor foot injuries could become serious. A small blister from an uncomfortable shoe sometimes developed into dangerous infections that lingered for weeks or months. And then there were the streets themselves. Victorian cities were filthy beyond modern imagination. Horse manure covered roads. Sewage leaked openly in many areas. Industrial pollution coated the air and pavement alike. Walking through London after rain was less like taking a pleasant stroll, and more like participating in a grim obstacle course designed by someone deeply angry at humanity. Now combine that environment with delicate boots, heavy dresses, slippery soles, and unstable heels. Women slipped constantly. Ankles twisted. Falls were common, especially while climbing carriage steps or navigating crowded staircases. Some injuries became permanent. Yet society continued insisting women move delicately and elegantly through streets that resembled open drainage experiments. Men's footwear was not always much better. Tight formal shoes caused foot deformities and chronic discomfort for many gentlemen trying to maintain respectable appearances. The Victorian obsession with polished perfection meant people often prioritized appearance over basic physical function. Even children suffered under these standards. Young girls sometimes wore restrictive boots from early childhood, shaping growing feet unnaturally before they fully developed. Apparently, Victorian society believed discomfort should begin as early as possible, ideally before algebra. And through all of this, fashion magazines continued praising tiny feet as beautiful and feminine. Humanity has always possessed a remarkable talent for taking normal anatomy personally. By the late Victorian era, manufacturers became fascinated with new industrial materials that promised luxury at lower prices. One of the most exciting inventions was celluloid, one of the world's first synthetic plastics. It could imitate ivory, tortoiseshell, and other expensive materials while costing far less. Victorian society immediately embraced it with the calm restraint of people who had learned absolutely nothing from arsenic dresses. Celluloid appeared everywhere. Hair combs, jewellery, buttons, fans, collar stays, vanity items, and decorative accessories all suddenly became cheaper and more widely available. To fashionable shoppers, it seemed like a miracle material. Unfortunately, celluloid had one small flaw. It was absurdly flammable. The material was made partly from nitrocellulose, which is chemically related to explosives. Heat, sparks, or open flames could ignite it frighteningly fast. And since Victorian life involved candles, fireplaces, gas lamps, cigars, and industrial machinery almost everywhere, this became a fairly serious design issue. Women wearing elaborate celluloid hair combs occasionally experienced terrifying accidents when the accessories overheated near flames or hot curling tools. Some combs warped or cracked suddenly. Others ignited outright. There were even reports of celluloid items exploding unexpectedly under intense heat or pressure. Imagine attending a polite Victorian dinner party, only for someone's decorative hairpiece to detonate beside the roast chicken. Very awkward for everyone involved. Factories producing these accessories were even more dangerous. Celluloid manufacturing plants caught fire constantly because the material burned so aggressively once ignited. Workers handled highly volatile chemicals in poorly ventilated spaces filled with heat and machinery. Entire workshops could erupt into flames within moments, and the fires spread with terrifying speed. Unlike ordinary materials, burning celluloid behaved almost like fuel. Thick smoke filled rooms quickly while flames raced across work tables piled with accessories and scraps. Victorian factory safety standards, meanwhile, generally consisted of try not to die near the expensive equipment. Even photographers face risks because early photographic film also used celluloid. Old film reels became notorious fire hazards. Projection booths occasionally turned into miniature infernos during screenings, so technically, the Victorians managed to make both fashion and entertainment slightly explosive at the same time. An impressive level of efficiency, really. Despite the dangers, celluloid remained popular for decades because it looked fashionable and cost less than natural luxury materials. Society accepted the occasional fire or explosion as an unfortunate inconvenience, rather than evidence that perhaps decorative objects should not share chemical similarities with ammunition. Victorian industry consistently approached innovation with the energy of a man enthusiastically juggling lit fireworks indoors, while insisting everything remained fully under control. Victorian society treated mourning almost like a competitive sport. After the death of Prince Albert in 1861, Queen Victoria entered a period of grief that lasted for decades. She wore black constantly, surrounded herself with reminders of her late husband, and transformed mourning into a massive cultural phenomenon. Naturally, society followed her example with tremendous enthusiasm and very little moderation. Entire industries suddenly formed around death fashion. Victorian mourning clothes were not simple black outfits. They were heavy, layered, restrictive, and governed by complicated social rules. Widows were expected to wear full mourning attire for years, depending on their relationship to the deceased. Some women spent longer dressed for mourning than they had actually spent happily married. The clothing itself could be miserable to wear. Heavy black crepe fabric became especially popular during deep mourning periods. Unfortunately, crepe was stiff, uncomfortable, and notoriously irritating to the skin. It trapped heat, collected dust, and absorbed moisture badly. Women wore layers of thick black fabric even during summer heat, because appearing appropriately miserable was considered socially important, and Victorian society took mourning rules extremely seriously. A widow who appeared too cheerful too quickly risked public judgment and gossip. Society expected visible suffering. Women attended social events dressed almost entirely in black, hidden beneath thick veils that restricted vision and airflow. Some veils were so dense they made walking outdoors genuinely dangerous. Crossing a busy London street while half-blind beneath layers of black fabric was essentially a polite Victorian version of extreme sports. Breathing also became difficult. Tight corsets combined with heavy mourning dresses and thick veils created exhausting conditions, especially during long funerals or crowded church services. Women fainted regularly, though Victorian culture continued interpreting this as feminine sensitivity, rather than the obvious consequence of restricted oxygen and excessive fabric. The dyes used in mourning clothes created additional dangers. Many black dyes contained toxic chemicals that irritated the skin or caused health problems through long-term exposure. Cheap mourning garments sometimes stained the skin directly, leaving wearers covered in black residue after hours of sweating beneath multiple layers. Even jewellery reflected the obsession with death. Mourning jewellery often contained woven hair from deceased loved ones. Lockets held portraits of dead relatives. Some rings included tiny compartments containing ashes. Imagine inviting guests into your home, only to discover someone proudly wearing their uncle's hair around their neck during dinner conversation. And perhaps the strangest part was how commercialised grief became. Shops advertised mourning collections aggressively. Tailors specialised in funeral fashion. Entire businesses thrived by helping people appear appropriately devastated in public. The Victorians somehow transformed personal sorrow into a strict social performance complete with dress codes, accessories and timelines. Because apparently losing a loved one was not difficult enough without also worrying whether your veil looked sufficiently tragic. Victorian hats gradually evolved from ordinary accessories into towering architectural projects, balanced precariously on the human head. By the late 19th century, fashionable women decorated hats with ribbons, artificial flowers, jewels, exotic feathers, and in many cases entire dead birds. Not feathers from birds, actual birds. Full wings, heads, beaks, glass eyes. Occasionally the complete animal arranged dramatically, as though it had simply landed there moments before suffering a fatal misunderstanding. The feather trade exploded across Europe and America, as fashion demanded increasingly extravagant designs. Hunters slaughtered millions of birds worldwide to satisfy the market. Egrets, hummingbirds, herons, birds of paradise, kingfishers. If it possessed attractive feathers, Victorian fashion eventually attempted to staple it onto a hat. Some species nearly disappeared entirely, and the process was especially brutal during nesting season. Hunters targeted adult birds while they cared for chicks, because breeding plumage looked more beautiful. The chicks then starved slowly in abandoned nests. Also, someone attending an afternoon tea could resemble an aggressively haunted peacock. Victorian fashion consistently asked itself not, "Should we do this?" but rather, "Would this look impressive near candlelight?" The hats themselves became absurdly large and heavy. Women balanced entire decorative ecosystems above their heads while navigating crowded streets and narrow carriage doors. Some hats required long pins to secure them properly, which introduced another delightful safety issue. Hat pins occasionally injured people during accidents or crowded public transport. Men complained constantly about being stabbed accidentally by fashionable women turning too quickly in public. Newspapers debated whether hatpins were becoming dangerous weapons. Society had somehow reached a point where decorative accessories were causing minor urban warfare on omnibuses. But the feathers brought additional health risks too. Poorly preserved bird skins often carried mites, fleas, bacteria, or mold. Dust from feathers irritated lungs and triggered allergic reactions. Some women wore these hats for hours in crowded indoor spaces beneath warm gas lighting, slowly inhaling particles from partially decomposing tropical birds positioned directly above their foreheads. And because Victorian cities were already filled with pollution, horse manure, industrial smoke, and questionable sanitation, adding dead exotic wildlife to the situation somehow felt perfectly reasonable. Eventually, public outrage over bird slaughter helped inspire early conservation movements. Activists campaigned fiercely against feather fashion, arguing that entire species were being wiped out for vanity. Their efforts later contributed to organisations like the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, so at least some good emerged from the madness. Still, there remains something deeply Victorian about transforming ecological destruction into a stylish afternoon accessory while discussing morality over tea and biscuits. Victorian gloves were considered essential for respectable society. A proper gentleman wore gloves outdoors. A proper lady wore gloves at dinners, dances, walks, church services, funerals, carriage rides, and probably while silently judging neighbours from across the street. Bare hands suggested vulgarity, labour, or poverty. Gloves represented refinement, status, and cleanliness, which was ironic, considering many of them were quietly poisoning the people wearing them. Fashionable gloves came in delicate colours like emerald green, bright yellow, lavender, and deep crimson. Creating these vibrant shades required powerful chemical dyes, many containing arsenic, chromium, lead, or other toxic compounds. The brighter and more luxurious the glove appeared, the greater the chance it contained something capable of medically concerning a modern toxicologist. And unlike dresses or hats, gloves remained in direct contact with the skin for hours. Sweat and body heat slowly released chemicals from the fabric and dye. People absorbed toxins gradually through constant exposure. Women wore tight gloves during long social events, while their hands became damp and overheated inside chemically treated materials. Imagine slowly poisoning yourself every evening simply because society considered visible fingers emotionally inappropriate. Factory workers producing the gloves suffered even worse conditions. Young workers handled toxic dyes daily in cramped workshops with poor ventilation and minimal protection. Their hands stained permanently from chemicals, skin peeled or blistered after repeated exposure. Some developed chronic respiratory problems from inhaling dye particles floating through the air, but wealthy customers remained mostly focused on whether the gloves matched the dress properly. Victorian etiquette surrounding gloves also became absurdly complicated. Gloves had to fit perfectly. Too loose appeared sloppy. Too tight risked splitting the seams dramatically during social events. which could apparently cause reputational damage comparable to public scandal. Women struggled to button extremely tight gloves using small hooks while preparing for events. Some gloves became so restrictive that movement felt difficult. Removing them elegantly required practice, patience, and occasionally divine intervention. And naturally, cleanliness became another issue. Many people reused gloves repeatedly because quality pairs were expensive. Gloves absorbed sweat, street grime, perfume, smoke, and bacteria over time. Washing delicate gloves proved difficult, so some simply accumulated layers of Victorian life inside the fabric like wearable historical evidence. By the end of a crowded London season, a fashionable pair of gloves had likely encountered horse manure, industrial pollution, toxic dyes, questionable public hygiene, and several mildly ill aristocrats coughing into opera handkerchiefs. Yet society still considered them symbols of sophistication. The Victorians possessed a remarkable ability to transform ordinary clothing into elaborate rituals of discomfort, contamination, and low-level chemical exposure, all while maintaining absolute confidence that they represented the peak of civilized behavior. Victorian society admired women who looked fragile, delicate, and impossibly thin. Ideally, a fashionable woman appeared as though a strong breeze or emotionally charged piano performance might finish her off entirely. Naturally, this led to deeply terrible dieting practices. Many women survived on painfully small meals to maintain tiny waists. Tea became a favourite substitute for actual nutrition because it suppressed appetite while allowing people to pretend they had eaten something substantial. Some women consumed little more than broth, toast, fruit, or cigarettes during the day, in pursuit of fashionable thinness. Victorian beauty standards basically encouraged women to slowly transform themselves into exhausted decorative ghosts. Doctors occasionally warned about malnutrition, weakness, and fainting, but society often interpreted these symptoms as attractive femininity rather than obvious physical collapse. A woman looking pale and tired was considered refined. A woman appearing energetic and healthy risked seeming vulgar or overly robust, which was apparently a social emergency. And then came the tapeworm diets. Yes, actual tapeworms. By the late 19th century, rumours spread about weight loss methods involving ingesting tapeworm eggs intentionally. The logic was horrifyingly simple. The parasite would consume part of the food inside the body, allowing the person to lose weight while continuing to eat normally. Humanity truly has an extraordinary talent for hearing intestinal parasite, and somehow arriving at beauty solution. Advertisements and questionable health guides occasionally promoted parasite-based slimming methods, though many stories were exaggerated or hidden behind euphemisms. Victorians loved disguising horrifying ideas beneath polite language. Internal dietary assistance sounds far more respectable than deliberately infecting yourself with a creature living inside your intestines. The consequences could be severe. Tapeworm infections caused weakness, nausea, abdominal pain, malnutrition, dizziness, and dangerous complications if the parasite grew large enough or spread beyond the intestines. Some infections lasted years, others caused permanent health problems. Removing the parasite was not always easy either, particularly in an age when medicine still occasionally prescribed cocaine and fresh air with complete confidence, and starvation itself carried enormous risks. Women weakened by extreme dieting suffered anemia, chronic fatigue, weakened immune systems, and reproductive problems, combined with tight corsets, heavy clothing, poor urban air quality, and exhausting social expectations. Many Victorian women existed in a near-constant state of physical depletion. Yet society praised them endlessly for appearing elegant and self-controlled. The truly remarkable thing about Victorian beauty culture was how often visible illness became fashionable. If a trend caused exhaustion, fainting, pale skin, weakness, or hollow eyes, there was always a strong possibility someone in high society would describe it as graceful rather than medically alarming. Civilization apparently is a very thin line between sophistication and collective self-destruction. Victorian grooming routines often resembled chemistry experiments conducted by people with tremendous confidence and very limited concern for long-term survival. Hair powders, perfumes, setting sprays, skin creams, and beauty tonics filled dressing tables across Europe and America. Wealthy homes smelled constantly of lavender, rosewater, alcohol, smoke, starch, and suspicious chemicals mixed together beneath candlelight. Walking into a Victorian dressing room was probably similar to entering a highly flammable flower shop located inside a laboratory. Hair powders remained especially popular for styling and maintaining fashionable appearances. These powders often contained finely ground starches, perfumes, chalk, dyes, and chemical additives designed to whiten or scent the hair. Applying them created thick clouds of airborne dust that floated through bedrooms and salons for hours. People inhaled this constantly. Women sat while servants brushed powder into elaborate hairstyles, filling enclosed rooms with particles that irritated the eyes, throat, and lungs. Some powders contained lead or other harmful substances, particularly cheaper products produced with little regulation, because naturally, once Victorian society discovered one dangerous beauty product, it became important to expand the collection. Perfumes brought their own problems. Many Victorian perfumes used alcohol-heavy formulas, combined with concentrated oils and chemical fixatives. In poorly ventilated rooms lit by candles or gas lamps, strong fumes became overwhelming. Some people experienced headaches, dizziness, nausea, or breathing difficulties after prolonged exposure. But since smelling pleasant was socially essential, everyone politely endured the equivalent of low-level aromatic warfare. And then there were the hair-setting products. Victorian hairstyles could be incredibly elaborate, requiring oils, waxes, pomades, sprays, and heated styling tools to maintain shape. Certain setting mixtures contained flammable alcohol or chemical ingredients that reacted badly near open flames. Since nearly every Victorian room contained candles, fireplaces, or gas lamps, beauty routines occasionally carried the same safety standards as preparing fireworks inside a library. Hair itself also became a surprisingly dangerous issue. Large hairstyles collected dust, soot, and pollution from Victorian cities, which were already drowning beneath coal smoke and industrial grime. Some people washed their hair infrequently because styling took so much effort. Hair oils and pomades trapped dirt against the scalp, sometimes causing irritation, infections, or lice infestations. And yet, despite all this, Victorian society remained obsessed with maintaining perfect appearances at all times. Women spent hours constructing hairstyles heavy enough to challenge basic neck strength, while breathing chemical powders inside overheated rooms. The truly impressive part is that the Victorians managed to transform ordinary grooming into a process involving respiratory irritation, toxic exposure, fire hazards, and occasional scalp infections. Then still describe the era as refined and civilized with complete sincerity. Victorian society adored jewellery with almost religious devotion. Rings, lockets, brooches, bracelets, earrings, chains, hairpins. If a person could physically attach decorative metal to part of the body, the Victorians immediately considered it an essential social requirement. And naturally, many of these beautiful accessories came with deeply questionable health consequences. Cheap jewellery often contained lead, copper, nickel, or poorly mixed metal alloys that reacted badly against the skin. Earrings caused infections regularly because piercing methods were far from sterile. Tiny cuts or irritations became dangerous in an era before antibiotics, especially in crowded industrial cities filled with smoke, dirt, and bacteria enthusiastically thriving in every available corner. A simple infected ear piercing could turn into weeks of swelling, fever, and misery. But appearance mattered more than comfort. So women continued wearing painfully heavy earrings and necklaces for long social events while pretending everything felt perfectly normal. Victorian fashion relied heavily on the principle that visible suffering should remain invisible if possible. Brooches and pins created their own hazards. Large decorative pins secured dresses, hats, collars, and layers of fabric together. Some were extremely sharp and surprisingly long. Accidental stabbings were common while dressing or moving through crowded spaces. A fashionable Victorian woman occasionally carried enough hidden metal spikes to qualify as lightly armed. And then there were mourning lockets. Victorian mourning culture became obsessed with preserving physical reminders of the dead. Lockets contained portraits, ashes, or woven hair from deceased relatives. Hair jewellery became especially popular because apparently society looked at grief and concluded it needed more accessories. Imagine attending dinner while the woman beside you casually explains that the bracelet she's wearing contains her late husband's hair carefully braided into decorative patterns. Victorian small talk truly operated on another level entirely. Some jewellery pieces also became physically exhausting to wear. Wealthy women layered heavy necklaces, chains, and decorative ornaments across dresses already weighed down by thick fabrics and corsets. Long evenings spent carrying several kilograms of metal and fabric left many women with neck pain, headaches, and fatigue. The pressure to display wealth through jewellery also encouraged dangerous thefts and robberies. Travelling through crowded streets while visibly covered in gold and gemstones was not always wise in Victorian cities where poverty remained widespread and policing inconsistent. Fashionable people sometimes walked around displaying the modern equivalent of "please rob me immediately" attached directly to their clothing. And despite all of this, society treated jewellery as essential proof of elegance and status. The more decorative and uncomfortable the accessory appeared, the more refined the wearer supposedly became. The Victorians possessed a remarkable ability to transform ordinary human decoration into a complicated mixture of vanity, infection risk, emotional discomfort, and mild physical injury, all while maintaining excellent posture at dinner parties. Perhaps the most dangerous Victorian fashion trend was not a dress, a corset, or a poisoned cosmetic. It was the belief that women should look permanently exhausted. Victorian beauty standards celebrated fragility with almost disturbing enthusiasm. The ideal upper-class woman was expected to appear pale, delicate, emotionally sensitive, physically weak, and slightly unwell at all times. Society admired women who looked as though climbing a staircase might require spiritual preparation afterward. Healthy colour in the cheeks suggested outdoor labour. Strong muscles appeared unfeminine. Energy itself became suspicious. Women were encouraged to move slowly, speak softly, eat lightly, and avoid excessive physical activity. Exercise remained controversial for many upper-class women because vigorous movement supposedly damaged femininity. Imagine living in a society where taking a brisk walk too confidently risked social criticism. Fainting became especially romanticized. Victorian novels, paintings, and theatre productions constantly portrayed women collapsing gracefully onto couches, while concerned gentlemen rushed forward dramatically. In reality, many women fainted because they were wearing crushing corsets, breathing stale air, eating too little, and existing beneath several kilograms of fabric in overheated rooms lit by gas lamps. Medical emergency? No. Apparently this was elegance. The famous fainting couch became a symbol of refinement, partly because women genuinely needed somewhere to recover after basic activities like standing upright during conversations. Victorian homes essentially included designated furniture for recovering from fashion itself. Doctors often reinforced these harmful ideals. Women diagnosed with nervous conditions were prescribed rest, isolation, and inactivity. Some were discouraged from reading too much or engaging in intellectual work because society feared education might overstimulate the female brain. Humanity has always shown remarkable creativity when inventing reasons women should remain quietly decorative. Many women suffered chronic anemia, malnutrition, exhaustion, and respiratory problems because the entire beauty standard rewarded visible weakness. Pale skin from poor health looked fashionable. Thinness from starvation appeared refined. Fatigue from restrictive clothing became feminine grace. The cruelest part was how these standards trapped women socially. A woman who appeared strong, outspoken, physically active, or independent often faced criticism for seeming improper. Victorian culture demanded women perform delicacy constantly, even when it actively damaged their health. Society had somehow transformed basic survival instincts into bad manners. And through all this suffering, the Victorians still considered themselves the height of civilized progress. An empire covered the globe. Industry expanded rapidly. Science advanced enormously, yet countless people continued applauding women for looking faint enough to collapse beside a piano after inhaling arsenic while balancing dead birds on their heads. Human history is truly magnificent sometimes. In Sparta, courtship did not begin with poetry, flirtation, or awkward compliments about someone's eyes. It began with military training, state supervision, and occasional public beatings, which, to the Spartans, counted as healthy social development. From early childhood, Spartan boys belonged less to their families and more to the state itself. At age 7, they entered the agoge, the brutal education system designed to transform noisy children into disciplined warriors capable of surviving cold, hunger, exhaustion, and conversations with Spartan elders. The boys slept in communal barracks, trained constantly, and learned to obey without hesitation. They wore minimal clothing, ate barely enough food, and were encouraged to steal supplies if necessary. If caught, they were punished harshly. Not for stealing, but for being incompetent enough to fail at it. Ancient Sparta always found new ways to make childhood feel like a hostage negotiation. Meanwhile, Spartan girls lived very differently compared to women in most Greek city-states. Unlike Athenian women, who were often expected to remain indoors managing households quietly, Spartan women exercised publicly, participated in athletic competitions, and received basic education. They ran races, wrestled, danced, and trained their bodies openly. Other Greeks found this horrifying. To many Athenians, the sight of a physically confident Spartan woman was more unsettling than an invading army. But Sparta had practical reasons for this system. Strong women, they believed, produced strong children. Nearly every aspect of Spartan life revolved around military survival and maintaining the citizen population. Romance itself became another branch of state policy. A deeply uncomfortable branch, admittedly, but still state policy. Young Spartan men spent most of their youth isolated from normal family life. Even after marriage, many men under 30 continued sleeping in military barracks with fellow soldiers. Imagine trying to maintain a healthy relationship, while your government insists you spend most nights sleeping beside sweaty men discussing spear formations. Modern couples complain about work-life balance. Spartan couples barely had a life section available at all, and yet courtship still happened beneath all the discipline. Young men and women observed each other during festivals, athletic contests, dances, and religious ceremonies. Spartan society actually encouraged attraction, though quietly and without much sentimental nonsense. Excessive emotional behavior was considered suspiciously un-Spartan. Nobody wanted to be remembered as the warrior who conquered 3 enemy cities, but fainted because a woman smiled at him near a temple. Love existed in Sparta. It simply had to survive the constant interference of the Spartan state first. Although Spartan society looked permanently one bad day away from declaring war on happiness itself, young men and women still had opportunities to meet each other. Naturally, these meetings occurred under strict traditions, public observation, and the looming presence of elders silently judging everyone's posture. Religious festivals played a major role in Spartan courtship. During celebrations honouring gods like Artemis and Apollo, young Spartans gathered for dances, athletic contests, singing competitions, and rituals that blended worship with social display. Unlike many Greek societies where respectable women stayed hidden indoors, Spartan girls appeared openly in public ceremonies. They danced, raced, sang in choruses, and sometimes performed athletic exercises wearing surprisingly light clothing by Greek standards. This caused endless scandal among outsiders. Athenians in particular were horrified. They viewed Spartan women the same way medieval monks might react to a nightclub. Writers from other city-states constantly complained about Spartan girls exercising publicly and speaking too freely. Meanwhile, the Spartans looked at Athens and saw pale intellectuals arguing about philosophy while requiring assistance lifting furniture. At these festivals, young men carefully observed potential wives. But Spartan attraction was rarely based on softness or charm alone. Physical fitness mattered enormously. Strength, discipline, health, and endurance were considered attractive because Spartan marriage was tied directly to producing future soldiers. Romance existed, certainly, but it came wrapped in state expectations and military practicality. Nothing says passionate courtship quite like being evaluated for your ability to survive childbirth or shield combat. Young women also judged the men carefully. A cowardly Spartan man faced public shame from nearly everyone, especially women. Spartan mothers famously told sons to return with your shield or on it, which is both historically memorable and perhaps the least comforting goodbye phrase ever invented. Conversation between young couples was often limited. Spartan culture admired restraint and disliked excessive emotional displays. Public flirting, dramatic declarations of love, or poetic performances would have seemed embarrassingly theatrical. If an Athenian man arrived singing romantic poetry beneath a Spartan woman's window, he would likely be handed a spear and told to do something useful. Still, attraction grew during these shared gatherings. Dancing together during festivals created rare moments where discipline loosened slightly, and young Spartans could glimpse each other beyond military expectations. Beneath the severe reputation of Sparta existed ordinary human emotions: curiosity, desire, nervousness, and admiration. They simply expressed those emotions with the emotional subtlety of a stone fortress, which in fairness was very Spartan. Spartan marriage customs were so unusual that even other Greeks occasionally stopped arguing with each other long enough to say, "What exactly are the Spartans doing now?" One of the strangest traditions involved the symbolic capture of the bride. When a Spartan man was finally ready to marry, the woman was not escorted into a beautiful ceremony filled with flowers and emotional speeches. Instead, her hair was cut short, she was dressed in a simple cloak and sandals, and she was placed alone in a dark room to wait for her husband. Romantic, in the same way a military ambush is romantic. The groom would secretly visit her at night, often sneaking away from his barracks, because Spartan men under 30 still lived and slept with their military units. Even after marriage, husbands were expected to continue their military discipline first and their family life second. Sparta truly believed the ideal way to strengthen romance was to make sure couples rarely saw each other. According to some ancient writers, these secret nighttime visits actually increased desire between husbands and wives. The logic was that constant separation prevented couples from becoming bored with each other. Modern marriage counselors might suggest communication, trust, and emotional support. The Spartans suggested hiding in darkness and sprinting back to the barracks before sunrise. And oddly enough, some historians think this system may have worked better than expected. Because Spartan husbands and wives spent limited time together, their meetings carried excitement and anticipation. A husband risking punishment to secretly visit his wife created an atmosphere closer to forbidden romance than ordinary domestic life. Still, the system remained deeply tied to Spartan priorities. Marriage was not considered a purely private matter. The state wanted healthy children and stable citizen families. Men who delayed marriage too long could face public ridicule. In some cases, unmarried older men were mocked during festivals or denied certain honours. Sparta viewed bachelorhood less as a personal choice and more as suspicious laziness. Women also held unusual influence within marriage compared to elsewhere in Greece. Spartan wives managed households, controlled property during their husband's absence, and often spoke with surprising authority. Foreign visitors sometimes complained that Spartan women were too powerful, which usually meant the women were capable of finishing sentences without asking permission first. Beneath the bizarre rituals and military obsession, Spartan marriage customs reveal something unexpected. Even in one of history's harshest societies, people still searched for intimacy, attraction, and connection. They just did it while dressed like off-duty soldiers lurking in alleyways at midnight. To outsiders visiting Sparta, one thing quickly became clear. Spartan women behaved very differently from women elsewhere in Greece. They spoke openly, exercised publicly, owned property, and occasionally insulted men with terrifying confidence. Naturally, many Greek writers reacted as if civilization itself were collapsing. In Athens, respectable women were expected to remain mostly inside the household, quietly managing domestic duties, while men handled politics, philosophy, and public life. Spartan women, meanwhile, were outdoors racing, training, singing in festivals, supervising estates, and telling warriors not to embarrass themselves in battle. The cultural difference was enormous. Spartan girls received physical training from a young age. They ran races, practiced wrestling, threw javelins, and danced in athletic festivals. The Spartans believed strong women produced strong children, and since Sparta treated childbirth as another contribution to military survival, female health became a public concern rather than a private matter. Romance in Sparta was always tangled together with state priorities. Even attraction itself became partially political. This unusual freedom shaped Spartan courtship in important ways. Spartan women often had more influence in choosing partners than women in many other Greek societies. A weak, cowardly, or dishonourable man could easily lose respect in the eyes of women, and Spartan women were not famous for hiding their opinions gently. Ancient sources describe women mocking cowardly soldiers publicly, which probably made military discipline extremely effective. Fear of enemy spears was one thing. Fear of becoming the subject of public ridicule from Spartan women was apparently far worse. Because Spartan men spent so much time away training or campaigning, women also controlled large portions of household property and daily management. By later periods, Spartan women owned significant amounts of land. Other Greeks found this deeply unsettling. Philosophers complained that Spartan women had too much freedom, which in ancient history usually translates loosely to they were allowed to speak without fainting first. This independence also affected marriage itself. Spartan wives were expected to be intelligent, capable, and physically strong enough to manage households alone during wartime absences. Marriage was not simply about obedience. It was about maintaining Spartan society, while the men spent half their lives preparing to stab neighbouring city-states professionally. And despite Sparta's harsh reputation, some ancient writers noted genuine affection between Spartan couples. The unusual balance of separation, mutual respect, and shared discipline may have created relationships that felt surprisingly equal for the ancient world. Though admittedly, equality in Sparta still involved occasional kidnappings, military inspections, and emotionally repressed midnight visits. History rarely offers perfect systems. For a society obsessed with discipline and order, Sparta handled married life with surprising levels of secrecy. Newly married Spartan couples often spent years meeting almost entirely at night, sneaking around like criminals whose great offence was legally recognising each other as husband and wife. After marriage, Spartan men under 30 usually continued living in military barracks rather than at home. Their loyalty belonged first to the Spartan state, second to their fellow soldiers, and somewhere farther down the list, hopefully, to their families. A husband was expected to train, eat, sleep, and fight alongside his comrades almost constantly. Domestic life existed in whatever exhausted hours remained afterward. Because of this system, many husbands visited their wives secretly after dark. Ancient writers describe men quietly slipping through the streets at night, avoiding detection before returning to the barracks by morning. Sparta had somehow transformed marriage into something resembling an illegal affair. And strangely, the Spartans considered this beneficial. They believed separation preserved passion and prevented couples from becoming overly attached or emotionally soft. Familiarity, in their eyes, weakened discipline. By limiting contact, desire supposedly remained stronger. The average Spartan marriage therefore contained equal parts affection, military scheduling, and covert nighttime operations. Young husbands likely became very skilled at stealth. After years of military training, crawling silently through darkness to visit your wife was probably considered excellent practical exercise. Somewhere in Sparta, an exhausted soldier was definitely whispering, "If I survive another spear drill tomorrow, perhaps I can spend 15 whole minutes speaking to my spouse." Despite the secrecy, Spartan society still valued successful marriages highly. Producing healthy children was considered a civic duty. Men who remained unmarried too long faced ridicule and social embarrassment. Sparta did not admire bachelors. It treated them like unfinished government projects. Some ancient accounts even suggest older men occasionally arranged for younger, stronger men to father children with their wives, if they believed it would strengthen the bloodline. Modern audiences tend to react to this with visible confusion, which is fair. Sparta approached family life with the same mentality it applied to military organisation. Efficiency first, emotional complications later, and yet genuine emotional bonds still formed between couples. In fact, the rarity of their meetings may have intensified affection. Each visit carried risk, anticipation, and excitement. Unlike many arranged marriages elsewhere in the ancient world, Spartan relationships sometimes developed through years of longing and separation. Of course, this does not mean Spartan romance was gentle or emotionally expressive. Nobody in Sparta sat writing dramatic love poems beside candlelight while softly weeping into wine. They were too busy climbing through windows before curfew and pretending not to have feelings. In Sparta, love was personal, But marriage was everyone's business. Literally everyone's. Your neighbours cared, your military commanders cared, elderly women at festivals cared, and somewhere in the distance an old Spartan politician was probably judging your reproductive efficiency with silent disappointment. The Spartan state placed enormous pressure on citizens to marry and produce children. Sparta constantly feared population decline because only full Spartan citizens could serve as elite warriors, and that number gradually shrank over time. Every marriage therefore carried political importance. Having children was not viewed simply as a family matter. It was considered a patriotic duty. Naturally, this created a deeply relaxing atmosphere for romance. Men who delayed marriage too long faced public humiliation. Ancient sources describe unmarried older men being mocked during festivals, excluded from certain honours, and even forced to endure embarrassing rituals. In one account, bachelors were made to dance naked during winter, while younger Spartans laughed and sang insulting songs about them, which is certainly one motivational strategy. Spartan society believed that a man unwilling to marry lacked discipline or courage. Cowardice was not limited to the battlefield. Failing to contribute to Sparta's future was treated almost like a social betrayal. Imagine living in a society where your relatives ask about grandchildren while holding spears. Women also participated in this culture of public pressure. Spartan women were famous for sharp tongues and brutal honesty. Cowardly men, weak men, or socially disgraced men often became targets of ridicule. Ancient writers repeatedly mention Spartan mothers and wives openly shaming those who failed military expectations. A Spartan woman insulting your bravery probably hurt more than an actual spear wound because at least the spear eventually stopped. This pressure influenced courtship heavily. Young men understood that marriage was expected, not optional, but women also expected strength, confidence, and honour from potential husbands. Spartan society admired emotional restraint, physical discipline, and courage above nearly everything else. Wealth mattered less than reputation. A respected warrior carried more social value than a rich coward, and despite all this severity, attraction still mattered. Spartan festivals, dances, athletic contests, and secret nighttime meetings all allowed relationships to develop gradually. Underneath the state pressure existed ordinary human emotions: nervousness, desire, admiration, jealousy. The difference was that Spartans experienced these emotions while surrounded by constant public judgment and military expectations. So if a Spartan man struggled with dating anxiety, there was always comfort in knowing failure might only result in lifelong humiliation before the entire city-state. Ancient self-esteem therapy at its finest. A traditional Spartan wedding lacked many things people normally associate with weddings: long ceremonies, emotional speeches, decorative flowers, elaborate feasts, or a groom nervously sweating through formal vows. Sparta preferred efficiency. If romance accidentally survived somewhere inside the process, that was considered a pleasant secondary outcome. The wedding itself was often surprisingly simple. There were rituals, sacrifices to the gods, and family arrangements. But compared to the extravagant celebrations found elsewhere in Greece, Spartan weddings felt restrained and practical. Excess luxury was deeply unpopular in Sparta. A massive golden banquet would have looked suspiciously decadent, the sort of thing Athenians might enjoy while discussing philosophy instead of maintaining military dominance. One of the strangest customs came immediately after the ceremony. The bride's hair was cut short, sometimes almost like a young man's hairstyle, and she was dressed in a plain cloak and sandals. Ancient historians still debate the exact meaning behind this ritual. Some believed it symbolized the transition into married life. Others suggested it helped ease the groom's nervousness by making the bride appear less unfamiliar, which is perhaps history's least reassuring explanation for a wedding tradition. Afterward, the bride waited alone in a darkened room while the husband secretly visited her later that night. Again, Spartan marriages somehow managed to feel both official and strangely illegal at the same time. The secrecy partly existed because many young husbands still lived in military barracks. Their lives remained controlled by Spartan discipline, and marriage could not interfere too heavily with military obligations. A man was expected to leave his wife before dawn and return to training with his fellow soldiers, as though he had merely stepped outside for fresh air, rather than secretly maintaining an entire marriage. And yet ancient writers claimed Spartan couples often developed strong affection for one another precisely because they spent so little time together. Every meeting carried anticipation. Familiarity arrived slowly. Desire remained intense. Sparta had accidentally invented the world's most exhausting long-distance relationship while living in the same city. Women also entered marriage with more authority than many Greek wives elsewhere. Spartan wives managed estates, supervised servants, and controlled households during their husbands' long absences. A capable Spartan woman was expected to run an entire home efficiently, while her husband practiced warfare professionally across the countryside. Underneath the harsh customs and military discipline, Spartan weddings reveal something surprisingly human. Even in a society obsessed with toughness, people still searched for closeness, intimacy, and companionship. They simply approached romance with the emotional atmosphere of an organized military campaign. By the standards of the ancient world, Spartan marriage was deeply unusual. By modern standards, it occasionally sounds like a government experiment designed by sleep-deprived military officers. And yet, beneath the harsh discipline and strange customs, Spartan society still valued loyalty and emotional connection in its own severe way. Spartans believed the ideal couple strengthened one another through discipline, endurance, and mutual respect. Marriage was not supposed to weaken a warrior's spirit with excessive softness. Instead, a wife was expected to inspire courage, dignity, and self-control in her husband. Spartan women were famous throughout Greece for speaking boldly and demanding strength from men. A coward might survive enemy arrows, but surviving the disappointment of a Spartan wife was another matter entirely. Ancient stories repeatedly show Spartan women encouraging bravery with startling bluntness. Mothers told sons to return with your shield or on it. Wives reportedly mocked husbands who behaved dishonorably in battle. Outsiders often viewed this as cold or cruel, but to Spartans, preserving honor mattered more than preserving comfort. Emotional weakness threatened the stability of the entire society. Still, Spartan relationships were not completely devoid of affection. Ancient writers occasionally described deep loyalty between husbands and wives. Because Spartan men spent so much time away training or fighting, reunions carried emotional weight. A returning husband was not merely arriving home from work, he was returning from a life constantly surrounded by danger, exhaustion, and the possibility of death. Women, meanwhile, managed households, property, finances, and family affairs independently during these absences. Spartan wives were expected to be capable leaders in their own right. This created relationships that often involved more mutual reliance than elsewhere in Greece. In Athens, a wife might remain largely hidden from public life. In Sparta, she might be overseeing land, servants, and economic matters, while publicly insulting weak politicians before breakfast. There was also a strange tension within Spartan romance itself. The state constantly interfered in private life, yet emotional attachment clearly survived underneath the regulations. Secret nighttime visits, long separations, and public expectations may actually have intensified feelings between couples. Desire grows easily when society treats seeing your own spouse like a covert military operation. And despite Sparta's terrifying reputation, many Spartan couples probably experienced familiar emotions recognizable today: longing, attraction, jealousy, pride, affection, and grief. They simply experienced those emotions while living in a city where children trained for war, weddings resembled kidnappings, and public flirting probably looked dangerously close to a disciplinary offense. History rarely does subtlety. Sparta certainly did not. Over time, the famous Spartan system that once terrified Greece slowly began to weaken. The discipline remained legendary, the stories remained dramatic, and the reputation survived for centuries. But underneath the image of perfect warriors, Sparta faced serious problems. And like many societies obsessed with strength, it eventually discovered that rigidity can become its own weakness. One major issue was population decline. Full Spartan citizens became fewer and fewer as generations passed. Spartan men died in wars, lost citizenship through poverty, or failed to meet the strict requirements expected by the state. Marriage customs that once seemed practical began creating demographic problems. Too few citizens were producing too few children. and Sparta gradually struggled to maintain its military dominance. The irony was painful. Sparta had built an entire society around producing perfect warriors, only to discover there were increasingly fewer Spartans left to train. As Spartan power faded after defeats like the Battle of Leuctra, the old traditions also weakened. Foreign influences entered Sparta more openly. Wealth inequality increased. Luxury slowly replaced some of the old discipline. The severe simplicity that once defined Spartan life became harder to maintain as political power declined. Eventually, Sparta became less the terrifying military machine of legend, and more a place tourists visited to hear stories about the terrifying military machine it used to be. But the image of Spartan courtship survived in ancient history because it remained so unusual. Few societies mixed romance and military discipline so completely. In Sparta, attraction was tied to strength, marriage was tied to state survival, and intimacy often existed in secret shadows between public duties. Love was allowed, but only carefully controlled, like a dangerous fire that might accidentally interfere with spear training. And yet, beneath all the rigid customs, Spartan couples were still human beings. Young men still felt nervous around women they admired. Young women still judged potential husbands carefully. Husbands still missed wives during long absences. Wives still feared losing husbands in war. Even inside one of history's harshest societies, ordinary emotions quietly survived. That may be the strangest part of Sparta itself. Behind the shields, military drills, kidnappings disguised as weddings, and emotionally repressed midnight visits, there were still people trying to build relationships in the middle of an unforgiving world. Though naturally, they did it while surrounded by public judgment, state pressure, and enough social anxiety to frighten modern therapists into immediate retirement. Corinth was not a quiet city. It was a city of shouting merchants, crashing waves, drunken sailors, expensive perfumes, political arguments, gambling dens, overloaded markets, and ships arriving day and night, carrying wealth from every corner of the Mediterranean. If Athens wanted to debate philosophy, Corinth preferred to sell wine to the philosophers and charge extra for watered cups. Positioned between two major harbours, Corinth became one of the richest trade cities in ancient Greece. Traders from Egypt, Persia, Italy, and the Greek islands passed through constantly. The streets overflowed with accents, currencies, religious customs, and people searching for opportunity. Some came to make fortunes, others came to lose them spectacularly in taverns before sunset. And among the merchants, priests, sailors, and politicians lived the courtesans of Corinth. These women occupied a strange and complicated place in Greek society. Ordinary women in many Greek cities were expected to remain hidden within households, quietly managing domestic life while men controlled politics and public conversation. Courtesans, however, often moved openly through elite social circles. Some attended banquets, entertained wealthy guests, discussed poetry and philosophy, and built relationships with influential men. Of course, this freedom came at a price. A courtesan's survival depended on beauty, intelligence, reputation, and social skill all at once. One careless scandal could ruin everything. One wealthy patron could change a woman's entire life overnight. Corinth rewarded success lavishly, but punished failure without mercy. Ancient capitalism was already functioning beautifully, ruthlessly but beautifully. The most famous courtesans, known as hetairae, were far more than simple entertainers. Many were educated companions trained in music, conversation, dance, and charm. Wealthy men sought them not only for physical attraction, but for status and emotional escape. In a society where respectable wives were often excluded from intellectual life, courtesans sometimes became the women elite men spoke to most honestly, which says several deeply uncomfortable things about ancient Greek marriage. Corinth itself encouraged excess. Taverns stayed crowded late into the night. Sailors spent money recklessly after months at sea. Festivals filled the streets with music and wine. The massive temple of Aphrodite overlooking the city added to Corinth's reputation for beauty, pleasure, and temptation. Ancient writers across Greece often described Corinthians as wealthy, indulgent, and morally questionable. Naturally, this only made the city more popular. For courtesans, Corinth offered rare opportunities unavailable elsewhere. A clever woman could gain wealth, influence, admirers, and independence. But every advantage existed beside constant danger, because in Corinth, attention was currency, and everyone in the city was trying to buy it, sell it, or survive from it. Not every courtesan in Corinth began life surrounded by silk, perfume, and wealthy admirers reclining on expensive cushions. Many began in poverty, slavery, debt, or simple desperation. Ancient Greece liked to celebrate beauty and elegance, but underneath the polished banquets and poetic compliments was a brutal reality. Survival usually came first. Some women entered the profession after being sold as slaves. Others were foreigners arriving from distant cities with few protections or family connections. A few may have chosen the life willingly because it offered freedoms unavailable through ordinary marriage. In many parts of Greece, respectable wives lived restricted lives inside the household, often married young and excluded from public conversation. A successful courtesan, meanwhile, could move through elite social circles, earn money independently, and influence powerful men directly. Of course, this freedom depended heavily on remaining attractive, intelligent, entertaining, and socially useful at all times. So naturally, it was a perfectly relaxing career with no pressure whatsoever. Young courtesans often trained carefully in music, dance, conversation, fashion, and etiquette. The elite heterae were expected to charm wealthy clients intellectually as well as physically. A successful evening might involve singing poetry, discussing politics, listening to philosophical debates, laughing at a merchant's terrible jokes, and pretending not to notice that the same merchant had spilled wine on himself 3 times already. Appearance mattered enormously. Expensive perfumes, carefully styled hair, jewellery, cosmetics, and elegant clothing all helped create the image wealthy men desired. Corinth's markets overflowed with imported luxuries from across the Mediterranean world, and courtesans used these goods strategically. In a competitive city filled with beauty and temptation, presentation became a form of survival. But behind the glamour existed constant uncertainty. Courtesans depended on reputation and patronage. Wealthy clients could become possessive, jealous, violent, or suddenly uninterested. Rivalries between courtesans could be ruthless. One scandal, one rumour, or one younger competitor arriving from another city could destroy years of carefully built success. Some women managed to gain remarkable wealth and independence. A famous courtesan might own property, servants, expensive clothing, and even influence political conversations indirectly through elite patrons. Others aged into poverty once their beauty faded or their connections disappeared. Corinth celebrated youth and charm enthusiastically, but it rarely rewarded loyalty. And so every evening became a performance. The laughter, elegance, flirtation, and confidence displayed at banquets often concealed something far less romantic underneath. The exhausting need to remain desirable in a city that consumed beauty as casually as it consumed wine. The true workplace of a Corinthian courtesan was not the street, it was the banquet. As evening settled over Corinth, wealthy men gathered inside private dining rooms, lit by flickering oil lamps and filled with music, perfume, roasted meats, and far too much wine. Merchants celebrated profitable voyages. Politicians argued loudly about alliances they barely understood. Sailors bragged about storms they probably exaggerated. Philosophers explained the meaning of life while servants quietly refilled their cups for the 6th time. And moving carefully through all of this chaos were the courtesans. At elite banquets known as symposia, courtesans entertained guests through conversation, music, dancing, poetry, and companionship. Unlike respectable wives, who were generally absent from these gatherings, courtesans participated directly in the social and intellectual atmosphere of elite male society. A skilled hetera needed far more than physical beauty. She needed memory, wit, emotional intelligence, and the ability to navigate rooms full of drunk, powerful men without losing control of the situation, which frankly sounds more exhausting than rowing a warship. A successful courtesan understood how to adapt herself to different clients. One merchant wanted admiration for his wealth. A politician wanted agreement with his opinions. A lonely traveller wanted companionship. A philosopher wanted someone patient enough to listen to him explain the universe for 4 straight hours, while forgetting to pay for dinner. Conversation itself became an art form. Courtesans learned how to flatter without appearing foolish, joke without insulting powerful egos, and encourage emotional attachment without surrendering independence completely. Wealthy patrons often became deeply attached to famous courtesans, spending enormous sums on gifts, jewelry, houses, or public displays of affection. But emotional attachment created danger as well. Jealousy was common. Rivalries between wealthy men could easily become violent, especially after excessive drinking. A courtesan who favoured one patron too openly risked angering others. Meanwhile, the city constantly watched and judged these women. Corinth admired luxury publicly, while condemning it morally at the exact same time. A tradition humanity has preserved with remarkable consistency for thousands of years. Despite the risks, some courtesans gained real influence inside these banquets. Men relaxed around them. Secrets slipped out during late-night drinking. Political gossip travelled quickly through these social circles. A clever courtesan might hear military plans, business deals, scandals, or private rivalries long before the wider city did. In Corinth, information was valuable, and sometimes the woman quietly pouring wine in the corner understood the city's power struggles better than the men loudly arguing about them across the table. In Corinth, beauty was not simply admired. It was weaponized, traded, protected, manipulated, and monetized with astonishing efficiency. A famous courtesan could influence wealthy merchants, attract political attention, and shape entire social circles without ever officially holding power herself. Ancient Greece loved pretending only men controlled society. Meanwhile, half the city was quietly rearranging itself around whichever woman had just entered the room. The most successful courtesans understood that physical beauty alone was never enough. Corinth overflowed with attractive people. Sailors arrived daily from across the Mediterranean, bringing foreign fashions, exotic perfumes, jewelry, cosmetics, and stories from distant ports. Competition was relentless. A woman who relied only on appearance rarely remained influential for long. Charm mattered more. Some courtesans became famous for their intelligence, humour, musical skill, or emotional control. They learned how to read people quickly. Who was insecure, who wanted admiration, who was dangerous, who could provide protection, and who was one cup of wine away from embarrassing himself publicly, which, in Corinth, eliminated perhaps 12% of the male population at best. Wealthy patrons often competed fiercely for elite courtesans. Expensive gifts became common. Gold jewellery, imported fabrics, servants, houses, and lavish public displays designed to prove status. In many ways, possessing the attention of a famous courtesan became its own form of social prestige. Men showed them off the same way later aristocrats displayed rare horses, paintings, or elaborate gardens. But unlike decorative objects, courtesans could influence conversations directly. Some women developed enormous informal power through their relationships with politicians, generals, and wealthy traders. A trusted courtesan might hear business secrets, diplomatic gossip, or political tensions long before they became public knowledge. Men often relaxed around them more openly than around rivals or family members. After enough wine, powerful people become remarkably generous with dangerous information. Still, this influence remained fragile. Corinth admired courtesans when they were fashionable and successful, but society's respect could vanish instantly. Beauty faded. Younger rivals appeared constantly. Patrons lost fortunes, changed loyalties, or became obsessed with someone new. A woman celebrated one year might struggle to survive the next. And beneath all the luxury existed the exhausting reality of performance. Every smile, gesture, conversation, and appearance carried calculation behind it. Courtesans needed to appear desirable without seeming desperate, intelligent without threatening male pride, emotionally warm without surrendering independence. It was a delicate balancing act performed nightly before wealthy audiences already halfway drunk. Corinth rewarded beauty generously, but only as long as beauty continued entertaining the city successfully. Corinth could make a courtesan wealthy, admired, and influential. It could also ruin her with one rumour whispered at the right banquet table. Competition between courtesans was constant. In a city overflowing with merchants, sailors, politicians, and travellers carrying money from across the Mediterranean, attention became the most valuable currency of all. Every woman competed for wealthy patrons, powerful allies, and social visibility. And unlike philosophy debates in Athens, these contests occasionally produced actual consequences. A famous courtesan needed to protect her reputation carefully. Beauty attracted clients, but reputation kept them returning. Wealthy men wanted charm, excitement, intelligence, and status. Nobody wanted to arrive at a banquet beside a woman currently involved in 3 public scandals and a knife fight near the harbour district. Though admittedly, in Corinth, that probably described at least one popular couple. Gossip spread through the city with terrifying speed. Sailors carried stories from tavern to tavern. Servants overheard conversations inside wealthy homes. Merchants exchanged rumours while negotiating prices at the market. One accusation, greed, betrayal, theft, disloyalty, or sleeping with the wrong man, could damage a courtesan's career overnight. Jealousy made everything worse. Powerful patrons often became possessive. A wealthy merchant financing expensive clothing and jewellery rarely enjoyed discovering his favourite companion entertaining a political rival the following evening. Some men attempted to control courtesans completely through gifts, money, or threats. Others became emotionally obsessed, mistaking purchased attention for permanent devotion. Human history has maintained this misunderstanding with remarkable consistency. Courtesans therefore needed more than beauty and charm. They needed strategy. A successful woman learned how to balance relationships carefully without appearing disloyal to anyone important. She needed allies among servants, musicians, merchants, and guards. She needed financial independence whenever possible. Most importantly, she needed to understand when powerful men became dangerous, because Corinth's luxury concealed real brutality underneath. A courtesan, losing favour, might suddenly lose housing, protection, income, or social access all at once. Aging brought constant anxiety. Younger women arrived continually from other cities, carrying fresh beauty and unfamiliar charm. Corinth celebrated youth aggressively and forgot older favourites with astonishing speed. And yet many courtesans survived by becoming experts in human behaviour. They understood vanity, loneliness, ambition, and weakness better than most philosophers ever could. While elite men debated honour and politics over wine, the women entertaining them quietly mastered the far more practical skill of staying alive in a city addicted to desire. In Corinth, survival often depended on reading a room faster than anyone else inside it. Towering above Corinth stood the temple of Aphrodite, goddess of love, beauty, desire, and judging by ancient Greek mythology, extremely complicated personal relationships. The temple overlooked the city from the Corinth, the massive hill fortress rising high above the crowded streets and harbours below. Sailors approaching Corinth could see it from far away, gleaming over one of the wealthiest and most infamous cities in Greece. To outsiders, Corinth quickly became associated with luxury, temptation, and excess. Ancient writers spoke about the city with equal parts fascination and moral panic, which usually means people were secretly very interested in visiting. Over time, stories spread claiming the Temple of Aphrodite employed large numbers of sacred prostitutes devoted to the goddess. Ancient sources exaggerated heavily at times, and historians still debate how much of this reputation reflected reality versus scandalized rumor. Greeks loved gossip almost as much as wine, and Corinth provided endless material for both. Still, religion and desire were deeply connected in the city's identity. Festivals honoring Aphrodite filled Corinth with music, processions, offerings, perfumes, dancing, and celebrations lasting deep into the night. Wealthy visitors donated enormous sums to temples while simultaneously making terrible personal decisions nearby. Ancient religion often blended spirituality and spectacle together so thoroughly that separating them became impossible. For courtesans, association with Aphrodite carried symbolic power. Beauty, seduction, elegance, and charm were not merely personal traits. They became almost sacred qualities connected to the goddess herself. A famous courtesan could cultivate an image that felt larger than ordinary life, presenting herself as refined, untouchable, and nearly divine in the eyes of wealthy admirers. Of course, behind every divine beauty stood exhausted servants arranging jewellery, preparing cosmetics, styling hair, and trying desperately to keep drunk merchants from vomiting on expensive carpets. Reality always ruins mythology eventually. The temple's reputation also attracted endless criticism from other Greeks. Philosophers and moralists condemned Corinth as corrupt and indulgent. Athenians especially enjoyed criticising Corinthian excess, while simultaneously importing its luxury goods and visiting its harbours constantly. Ancient hypocrisy was already functioning at elite levels long before modern politics perfected it. Yet the reputation endured because Corinth represented something larger than simple pleasure. The city embodied temptation itself. Wealth, beauty, opportunity, ambition, freedom, and danger, all packed tightly together between crowded harbours and glowing banquet halls. And for many courtesans, the temple of Aphrodite standing above the city served as a constant reminder of both their power and their fragility. In Corinth, beauty could elevate a woman almost to legend. But legends, unfortunately, still needed to survive the next evening. Corinth adored beauty, but it adored new beauty even more. For young courtesans at the height of their popularity, the city could feel intoxicating. Wealthy patrons competed for attention. Expensive gifts arrived constantly. Invitations to banquets, festivals, and elite gatherings filled entire weeks. A famous courtesan might walk through the streets surrounded by perfumes, jewellery, servants, and whispered admiration from strangers. But beneath the luxury existed a quiet fear that never fully disappeared: time. A courtesan's success depended heavily on maintaining attraction in a city permanently flooded with younger competitors. New ships arrived daily carrying merchants, entertainers, slaves, dancers, and women seeking opportunities of their own. Corinth consumed novelty endlessly. What fascinated the city one year could become old news by the next festival season. Many courtesans understood this early and tried to prepare carefully. Some saved money, purchased property, or invested in businesses through trusted associates. Others attempted to secure long-term protection from wealthy patrons. A few managed to transition into respected hostesses, musicians, or managers, overseeing younger women entering elite social circles. Others were not so fortunate. Aging in Corinth could be brutal. Patrons lost interest. Invitations became less frequent. Wealth disappeared quickly once expensive lifestyles could no longer be maintained. A woman celebrated at lavish banquets in her youth might later struggle quietly in poverty, while watching younger courtesans occupy the same rooms she once dominated. And Corinth rarely rewarded loyalty. The same men who once praised a woman's beauty endlessly often vanished once her influence faded. Public admiration in ancient cities was astonishingly temporary. Greek poets loved describing eternal beauty, usually while abandoning yesterday's eternal beauty for someone younger across the harbour. Still, older courtesans often possessed something more valuable than youth alone: experience. They understood people deeply. They recognized manipulation, ambition, insecurity, loneliness, and danger faster than younger women could. Some became advisors or mentors, teaching newcomers how to survive elite society without losing everything immediately. In a city built on appearances, experience became one of the few forms of power that could not simply be painted onto a face with cosmetics. And despite Corinth's obsession with youth, certain famous courtesans remained respected because of their intelligence, wit, and reputation long after their physical beauty began fading. Charm could outlive appearance if managed carefully enough. But the anxiety never vanished completely. Every mirror, every banquet, every younger rival entering the room carried the same silent reminder. Corinth loved beauty passionately, but only temporarily. The city treated desire like the sea surrounding its harbours, constantly moving, impossible to hold, and entirely indifferent to whoever drowned in it yesterday. For all the luxury surrounding Corinthian courtesans, many lived emotionally complicated lives hidden beneath layers of perfume, silk, and practiced confidence. Wealthy men desired them constantly, admired them publicly, and spent fortunes keeping them close. Yet admiration did not always bring security, and attention rarely guaranteed affection. In fact, the more successful a courtesan became, the harder genuine trust often became. Many patrons treated relationships as transactions wrapped in romantic language. A merchant might swear eternal devotion after too much wine, only to disappear on the next trading voyage beside a younger companion from another port city. Politicians promised protection while quietly negotiating alliances elsewhere. Generals spoke passionately about loyalty immediately before leaving for war with 3 servants carrying someone else's jewellery behind them. Ancient romance was apparently very committed to inconsistency. Courtesans learned quickly that emotional attachment could become dangerous. Falling genuinely in love with a patron risked financial dependence, heartbreak, or public humiliation. A wealthy admirer controlled gifts, housing, influence, and sometimes personal safety. Losing his favour could destroy stability overnight. Many women therefore maintained careful emotional distance, even while performing warmth and intimacy professionally. But human beings are not particularly good at separating emotion from constant companionship. Some courtesans formed genuine attachments despite the risks. Long evenings spent talking at banquets, private conversations after crowded festivals, and years of shared familiarity could create real affection between people living inside these arrangements. Ancient writers occasionally describe powerful men becoming sincerely devoted to famous courtesans, treating them less like entertainers and more like trusted partners. Of course, society rarely respected these relationships fully. Respectable marriage remained the ideal publicly, even though many elite men spent enormous amounts of time and money pursuing courtesans instead. Greek society maintained a remarkable ability to condemn women for providing pleasures men never stopped demanding enthusiastically. Civilization has preserved this contradiction almost professionally ever since. Loneliness also haunted many courtesans beneath the glamorous surface. Their lives revolved around performance. Every smile, compliment, joke, or flirtatious glance carried calculation behind it. They spent years studying what other people wanted, while often hiding their own fears completely. In a city obsessed with appearances, revealing vulnerability could become dangerous, and so many courtesans lived surrounded by admiration, but uncertain how much of it was real. Did patrons love them genuinely, or merely the fantasy they represented? Did wealth bring freedom, or simply a more luxurious form of dependence? In Corinth, these questions rarely had comforting answers, because the city sold desire constantly. But desire and security were never the same thing. For centuries, Corinth thrived as one of the Mediterranean's richest and most seductive cities. Its harbours overflowed with trade, its markets glittered with imported luxuries, and its nights stretched endlessly beneath oil lamps, music, and the sound of merchants losing money confidently. The city built its identity around movement, desire, and opportunity, and for a time, the courtesans of Corinth stood at the centre of that world. They entertained powerful men, shaped elite social circles, gathered secrets at banquets, and navigated a society that both admired and condemned them simultaneously. Some achieved remarkable wealth and influence. Others vanished quietly into poverty once age. Scandal or changing fortunes erased their place in the city's attention, because Corinth itself eventually changed. Wars disrupted trade routes. Political struggles weakened Greek independence. Foreign powers expanded across the Mediterranean. The proud city that once controlled enormous wealth gradually lost some of its old dominance as larger empires rose around it. Macedonia arrived. Later came Rome. And Rome naturally looked at Corinth and thought, "Wonderful city, we'll be taking that now." In 146 BC, the Roman general Lucius Mummius destroyed Corinth after a major uprising. The city was burned, looted, and devastated. Wealth disappeared. Temples collapsed. Families scattered. The famous luxury and glamour that once defined Corinth vanished beneath violence and ash. Ancient cities often lived dramatically and died even more dramatically. Corinth would later be rebuilt under Roman rule, but it never fully recovered the same identity it once possessed during its Greek height. The old world of elite Greek banquets, famous hetairai, and bustling harbour rivalries slowly faded into history and legend. Yet the reputation endured. Even centuries later, writers still spoke about Corinth as a symbol of wealth, temptation, beauty, and excess. The courtesans became part of that mythology, figures representing both freedom and vulnerability, inside one of antiquity's most restless cities. And perhaps that is why their stories remain fascinating. Because beneath the glamorous image existed something deeply human. These women were not simply symbols of pleasure or scandal. They were survivors navigating a harsh and competitive world using intelligence, beauty, charm, strategy, and emotional control. They lived inside a society built largely by powerful men, while somehow finding ways to influence that society from within its shadows. Not every courtesan became wealthy. Not every story ended happily. Corinth rewarded success brilliantly and punished weakness without hesitation. But for a brief moment in ancient history, some women in Corinth managed to turn attention itself into power, which is impressive, considering most of the men surrounding them could barely survive a banquet without arguing, crying, or falling asleep beside a wine jug. Before Alexander the Great conquered Persia, marched across deserts, founded cities from Egypt to Central Asia, and developed the deeply modest ambition of ruling most of the known world, he was a boy standing beside his father in a dusty Macedonian field, watching grown men lose arguments against a horse. The horse was massive, coal-black, muscular, wild-eyed, and violently unpredictable. The animal terrified nearly everyone who approached him. Traders had brought the horse to King Philip II of Macedon, hoping to sell him for an enormous price. They claimed the beast possessed unmatched strength and speed. What they neglected to emphasize quite enough was that the horse also seemed possessed by the spirit of absolute hatred. The moment riders approached, chaos began. Bucephalus reared violently, kicked the air, snapped at handlers, and threw experienced horsemen directly into the dirt with impressive efficiency. One rider barely managed to climb onto the saddle before being launched sideways like discarded laundry. Another lost control immediately and stumbled backward, while the horse screamed and charged across the field. Dust filled the air. Soldiers shouted. Stable hands struggled desperately to grab the reins without losing teeth. King Philip grew irritated quickly. The horse was expensive, dangerous, and apparently incapable of behaving like a civilized animal for even 30 consecutive seconds. Around him stood Macedonian nobles and veteran warriors, men experienced in hunting, cavalry warfare, and battlefield command, and none of them could control this creature. Watching nearby was Philip's young son, Alexander. At the time, Alexander was still a teenager, though not an ordinary one. He had been raised among warriors, taught by philosophers, trained in hunting and combat, and constantly reminded that he belonged to the Argead dynasty, a royal family claiming descent from heroes like Heracles himself, which is a tremendous amount of pressure to place on a child before breakfast. Alexander observed the chaos carefully, while the adults around him mocked the horse as useless. But unlike the others, he noticed something strange. Bucephalus was not reacting randomly. The horse panicked every time his own shadow appeared moving across the ground. While experienced men cursed the animal and called for it to be removed, Alexander stepped forward calmly and announced that the horse could be tamed. The older men laughed immediately. A prince embarrassing himself publicly before hardened cavalrymen rarely ends well. But history occasionally changes because one stubborn boy decides everyone older than him is wrong. And unfortunately for the rest of the world, Alexander was usually very confident about that. While the grown men around him argued, cursed, and dusted themselves off after losing battles against a horse, young Alexander kept watching Bucephalus carefully. That alone already separated him from most people in the field. The others saw only a dangerous animal. Alexander saw a pattern. Every time Bucephalus turned a certain direction, he panicked violently. His muscles tightened, his eyes widened, and he lashed out at anyone nearby. But when he faced toward the sun, he calmed slightly. The horse was not simply savage or untamable. He was frightened by the movement of his own shadow across the ground. Alexander noticed this, while fully grown cavalrymen apparently remained committed to the military strategy of pull harder on the reins and hope for the best. According to ancient accounts, Alexander turned to his father and criticized the men handling the horse, declaring they were ruining a magnificent animal through incompetence, which is an extraordinarily bold thing for a teenager to say publicly to experienced warriors surrounding the king of Macedon. Philip reportedly laughed at first. Everyone did. The prince was young, ambitious, intelligent, and already known for possessing dangerous amounts of confidence. Macedonia's nobles likely assumed this would end with Alexander flying through the air directly into a patch of dirt like everyone else before him. But Alexander insisted. He even offered to pay for the horse himself if he failed to tame it. An impressive promise, considering he was still technically spending his father's money. History's greatest conqueror was already making reckless financial bets before adulthood. Finally, Philip allowed him to try. The field grew quieter as Alexander approached Bucephalus slowly. Unlike the others, he did not yank the reins or attempt to overpower the animal immediately. Instead, he spoke calmly, stroked the horse gently, and carefully turned him toward the sunlight so the shadow disappeared behind him. The change was immediate. Bucephalus stopped fighting quite so violently. The horse still trembled with nervous energy, but Alexander had identified the true problem: fear, not aggression. While everyone else saw stubbornness, Alexander saw panic. That moment mattered enormously, because the scene revealed something far more important than simple bravery. Many men were brave enough to approach a dangerous horse. What shocked the crowd was Alexander's ability to observe carefully, think differently, and remain calm, while others reacted emotionally. In other words, the adults watching the field suddenly realized something uncomfortable. The prince was not merely fearless. He was intelligent in a way that could become extremely dangerous, once combined with power, ambition, and an army. The entire field watched as Alexander prepared to mount the horse. No one expected success. Most likely expected entertainment. Macedonian nobles had just spent the afternoon watching trained riders get humiliated publicly by a horse with the temperament of an angry thunderstorm. Now, a teenage prince was calmly walking toward the same animal, as though this were all perfectly reasonable. Bucephalus still snorted violently, muscles tense beneath his dark coat. The horse pawed the ground nervously while sunlight flashed across his eyes. One wrong movement could send him exploding into panic again. Stable hands stood ready to jump backward at any moment, which, to be fair, had already become their primary occupation for the day. But Alexander stayed calm. He continued speaking softly to the horse while holding the reins firmly. Ancient sources describe him stroking Bucephalus and gradually gaining the animal's trust. More importantly, Alexander kept the horse facing directly toward the sun, so the shadow remained behind him. While the adults nearby focused on controlling the horse physically, Alexander focused on removing the horse's fear entirely. It was a surprisingly intelligent solution for someone still young enough to be lectured about responsibility by his parents. Slowly, Bucephalus settled. The wild rearing stopped. The violent snapping eased. Alexander waited patiently for the exact moment the horse relaxed just enough, then mounted him in one smooth motion. And suddenly the entire field held its breath. For a few terrifying seconds, Bucephalus tensed again beneath the young prince. One mistake would throw Alexander directly into the dirt before half the Macedonian court. But instead of panicking, Alexander leaned forward confidently and guided the horse into motion. Then Bucephalus began to run. The black stallion charged across the open field at full speed, with Alexander riding firmly in the saddle. Dust exploded beneath pounding hooves while the crowd watched in stunned silence. The same horse that had humiliated experienced riders moments earlier now obeyed a teenage boy calmly steering him across the Macedonian countryside, and Alexander looked completely at home doing it. Ancient writers describe the crowd erupting into cheers when the prince finally returned safely. Philip himself reportedly became emotional watching the scene unfold. According to legend, the king embraced his son and declared, "My boy, seek a kingdom equal to yourself. Macedon is too small for you," which is both one of history's greatest compliments and perhaps the worst possible thing you could say to an already ambitious teenager, because from that moment onward, many people around Alexander began suspecting something unsettling. This boy was not destined for an ordinary life, and unfortunately for Persia, Egypt, and much of Asia, they were absolutely correct. When Alexander rode Bucephalus back across the field, something had changed. Moments earlier, the gathering had been laughing at an overconfident teenager preparing to embarrass himself publicly. Now the same men stood watching in stunned silence as the prince controlled the most feared horse any of them had seen. Dust clung to Bucephalus's black coat as the stallion slowed beside the king. The horse that had been kicking, screaming, and throwing trained riders into the dirt now obeyed Alexander calmly, almost proudly. The transformation felt almost unreal, and King Philip II noticed every detail. Philip was not an easily impressed man. He had spent years rebuilding Macedon into a military powerhouse through warfare, political alliances, assassinations, reforms, and relentless ambition. This was a king who measured people constantly. Weakness irritated him, talent interested him, potential fascinated him. What he saw in Alexander that day unsettled him slightly. because the prince had demonstrated something beyond simple courage. Plenty of young nobles were brave. Most were reckless enough to approach danger if enough people were watching. But Alexander had shown observation, patience, confidence, and intelligence under pressure. Qualities far more dangerous in a future ruler than raw bravery alone. According to ancient tradition, Philip embraced his son and declared, "Seek a kingdom equal to yourself. Macedon is too small for you." Now, historians debate whether Philip truly said those exact words, or whether later writers improved the dialogue dramatically for maximum historical impact. Ancient historians occasionally treated conversations the same way modern filmmakers treat explosions. Larger was usually considered better. Still, the meaning mattered. Even Philip recognized that his son's ambition would never fit comfortably inside ordinary limits. Alexander himself likely understood this already. From childhood, he had been surrounded by stories of heroes like Achilles and Heracles. His mother Olympias filled his imagination with myths and destiny. His tutors trained him in philosophy, literature, warfare, and leadership. Everywhere around him existed the constant suggestion that he was meant for greatness, which is either excellent motivation or catastrophic parenting, depending on how history unfolds afterward. The taming of Bucephalus quickly became legendary within Macedon because it symbolized the beginning of something larger. The horse itself became tied permanently to Alexander's identity. Bucephalus would carry him into battles across Asia for years to come, surviving deserts, sieges, rivers, and bloody battlefields beside him. But on that day, none of that future existed yet. There was only a prince, a horse, and a growing realization spreading through the crowd that this boy possessed something difficult to define: the strange mixture of intelligence, fearlessness, and ambition that history tends to remember long after kingdoms collapse. After the field emptied and the excitement faded, Bucephalus did not disappear back into the royal stables as just another horse. He became Alexander's horse, and from that moment forward, the black stallion followed the young prince through nearly every major chapter of his life, carrying him from Macedonian training grounds to the edges of the known world itself. It is one of history's strangest and most enduring partnerships. A boy with limitless ambition, and a horse too angry for anyone else to ride. In many ways, they suited each other perfectly. Alexander himself was already developing a reputation for intensity. He studied philosophy with Aristotle, trained constantly in warfare, hunted aggressively, and competed fiercely against other nobles. He admired heroes like Achilles obsessively, and reportedly kept a copy of Homer's Iliad close beside him, even during military campaigns later in life. Ordinary success never interested him much. He wanted glory, immortality, conquest, preferably all before middle age, which, unfortunately for the Persian Empire, turned out to be a very achievable plan. Bucephalus became part of Alexander's growing legend because the horse symbolized qualities Macedonians admired deeply: strength, endurance, pride, and controlled ferocity. The stallion was not gentle or obedient by nature. Alexander had not broken him completely. Instead, he had earned the horse's trust through understanding and confidence. That distinction mattered. Ancient writers later described Bucephalus almost like a war companion rather than an animal. During campaigns, Alexander reportedly refused to let others ride him. The horse carried him through dangerous battles, river crossings, brutal weather, and impossible marches across Asia. Soldiers began seeing Bucephalus as inseparable from the king himself, and the legend kept growing. Stories spread that Bucephalus was unusually intelligent, fiercely loyal, and capable of recognizing Alexander's voice even in the chaos of battle. Some accounts were probably exaggerated over time, naturally. Ancient historians loved adding dramatic details to successful conquerors. A king simply owning a horse was never enough. The horse had to become practically mythical by chapter 3. Still, the bond between them was clearly real. For Alexander, Bucephalus represented more than status or military usefulness. The horse reminded him of the moment he first proved himself publicly before the Macedonian court. The day grown men stopped seeing him merely as Philip's son and started seeing him as something far more dangerous. A future king, a future conqueror, a young man who looked at impossible situations and assumed, with terrifying confidence, that he alone understood how to control them. By the time Alexander became king of Macedon, after Philip's assassination, Bucephalus was no longer merely a famous horse from an old childhood story. He had become part of Alexander's image itself, almost a living symbol of the young ruler's confidence, ambition, and frightening ability to survive situations that should have killed him repeatedly. And once Alexander launched his invasion of the Persian Empire, Bucephalus followed him into war. The campaigns were brutal from the beginning. Macedonian soldiers marched across mountains, rivers, deserts, and hostile territory for years at a time. Battles arrived constantly. Cities resisted. Armies collided in chaos filled with screaming horses, flying spears, collapsing formations, and enough dust to make breathing feel optional. Somewhere inside all of this rode Alexander and Bucephalus together. Ancient cavalry warfare demanded enormous trust between rider and horse. A warhorse had to charge directly toward walls of shields, crashing spears, and terrified men swinging blades wildly in every direction. Most reasonable animals would look at the situation once and immediately request retirement. Bucephalus instead carried Alexander into battle after battle beside the elite companion cavalry. And Alexander fought recklessly. He led charges personally, rode close to enemy lines, and constantly exposed himself to danger in ways that horrified his generals. Throughout his campaigns, he suffered wounds from arrows, swords, stones, and spears. Yet he seemed almost addicted to proving himself physically in combat beside his soldiers. He did not want merely to command history. He wanted to ride directly through it. Bucephalus became essential to that image. The horse carried Alexander at major battles like Granicus and Issus, where Macedonian forces defeated massive Persian armies despite overwhelming odds. Soldiers watching their king charge fearlessly across battlefields atop the giant black stallion likely felt they were following someone touched by destiny itself. Ancient armies relied heavily on symbolism, and Alexander understood this instinctively. Of course, symbolism becomes easier when you are winning constantly. Stories about Bucephalus spread alongside stories about Alexander's victories. The horse became legendary across the empire growing around them. Foreign rulers heard tales not only of the young conqueror, but also of the massive black horse carrying him through impossible victories. And through every campaign, Alexander reportedly cared for Bucephalus personally. He refused to replace him despite opportunities to own countless magnificent horses captured during conquest. The bond between them had become emotional as much as practical, which is strangely touching considering most of Alexander's daily activities involved sieges, warfare, political executions, and occasionally setting entire cities on fire after drinking too much wine at victory celebrations. As Alexander pushed deeper into Asia, the world around him became stranger, larger, and far more exhausting than anything the Macedonians had imagined back home. They crossed scorching deserts where water vanished for days. They climbed mountains covered in snow and narrow cliffs capable of killing soldiers before the enemy even appeared. They marched through foreign cities filled with unfamiliar languages, gods, animals, and customs. At times, the campaign barely resembled a war anymore. It felt more like an entire civilization, sleepwalking endlessly eastward behind one man's ambition. And through all of it, Bucephalus remained beside Alexander. By now, the horse had become almost legendary within the army itself. Veterans who had followed Alexander for years viewed the black stallion with near-religious admiration. New recruits arriving from conquered territories heard stories about the horse long before ever seeing him. The beast no one could tame except the king. The horse that had carried Alexander through impossible victories. The animal supposedly blessed by destiny itself. Ancient armies loved mythology. It made dying in distant deserts feel slightly more meaningful. Alexander encouraged these legends carefully. He understood symbolism better than most rulers twice his age. Every appearance mattered. When soldiers saw Alexander riding Bucephalus confidently at the front of the army, it reinforced the image that their king remained unstoppable, no matter how far from home they travelled. But the campaigns were taking a toll on everyone, including the horse. Bucephalus was aging. Years of warfare, harsh climates, endless marches, and brutal battles had worn him down. War horses lived difficult lives even under ideal conditions, and Alexander's conquests were very far from ideal conditions. Yet Bucephalus continued carrying the king across thousands of miles of hostile territory. The bond between horse and rider also deepened emotionally over time. Alexander trusted very few people completely. Court politics, rivalries, betrayals, and conspiracies surrounded him constantly as his empire expanded. Friends died, generals argued, alliances shifted, but Bucephalus remained a constant presence through all of it. There is something strangely human about that. The man attempting to conquer the known world, a figure later treated almost like a myth himself, still found comfort in the familiar companionship of the same horse he had tamed as a boy years earlier in Macedon. And perhaps that connection mattered, because Alexander increasingly lived in a world where almost everything else kept changing around him. Empires expanded, cities burned, armies marched endlessly east. But somewhere ahead of the marching columns rode Alexander atop Bucephalus, still chasing glory with the same dangerous confidence he had shown as a teenager, staring down a frightened horse in a dusty field. By the time Alexander reached India, both the king and his army were exhausted. They had marched for years across mountains, deserts, rivers, and battlefields, stretching farther than most Macedonians had ever imagined the world could possibly continue. The soldiers were aging. Horses collapsed from exhaustion. Supplies grew harder to manage. And still Alexander kept pushing eastward, driven by the same relentless ambition that had terrified grown men back in Macedon when he was still a boy. Then came the Battle of the Hydaspes. Fought against King Porus in northern India, the battle was one of the hardest Alexander ever faced. Monsoon rains soaked the battlefield. Mud swallowed movement. War elephants thundered through the chaos like living fortresses, terrifying horses unused to such creatures. Macedonian soldiers suddenly found themselves fighting in conditions that felt less like glorious conquest, and more like the gods personally testing everyone's patience. And somewhere inside that nightmare rode Bucephalus. By now the horse was old for a war horse. Years of campaigns had worn him down physically. Yet Alexander still trusted him completely. Ancient sources differ on exactly what happened during or after the battle. Some claim Bucephalus was wounded in combat. Others suggest age and exhaustion finally overcame him shortly afterward. But the result remained the same. Bucephalus died in India. For Alexander, the loss was deeply personal. This was not simply the death of a valuable horse. Bucephalus had accompanied him from youth into legend itself. The stallion had carried him through the greatest victories of his life, through moments of danger, triumph, fear, and glory, stretching across half the known world. The horse had been there before the empire existed, and now suddenly he was gone. Alexander reportedly mourned Bucephalus intensely, and founded a city in his honour, Bucephala. Even at the edge of conquest, with armies to command and empires collapsing beneath his campaigns, he stopped to memorialise the animal that had ridden beside him since childhood. That detail matters, because beneath all the mythology surrounding Alexander, the conqueror, the strategist, the almost superhuman figure later generations admired obsessively, there was still a man capable of genuine attachment and grief. And perhaps the death of Bucephalus symbolised something larger as well. The reckless young prince who once tamed a frightened horse in Macedon was disappearing too. Years of conquest had changed Alexander into something harder, more isolated, and increasingly consumed by ambition. The horse connected him to the beginning, to youth, to home, to the moment before history stopped treating him like a boy and started fearing what he might become. Long after Alexander died in Babylon at just 32 years old, people still remembered the story of Bucephalus. They remembered the wild black horse no one could control. They remembered the stubborn prince who stepped forward while grown men laughed. And they remembered the moment a boy turned a terrified animal toward the sunlight and changed his own destiny in the process. Because the story was never really just about a horse. It became one of the earliest signs that Alexander possessed something unusual, the ability to see what others missed. While experienced riders saw only aggression, Alexander recognized fear. While older men reacted with force and frustration, he responded with patience and observation. That combination of intelligence and confidence would later help him conquer an empire stretching from Greece to India, though admittedly, conquering most of the known world after taming one difficult horse is an extremely aggressive form of career progression. Over time, the tale grew into legend, Ancient historians retold it constantly because it captured everything people found fascinating about Alexander. Youth, ambition, courage, intelligence, and the dangerous belief that impossible things could simply be solved if he approached them differently from everyone else. And for much of his life, that belief kept working. Alexander defeated armies larger than his own, crossed territories considered impassable, survived battles that should have killed him, and built one of history's greatest empires before reaching middle age. To later generations, the taming of Bucephalus almost felt like prophecy, the first small glimpse of the conqueror he would eventually become. But there is also something strangely human hidden inside the story. At the centre of all the conquest, politics, and mythology stands a frightened horse and an observant teenager trying to calm him. Before Alexander became the Great, before cities carried his name and kings feared his armies, he succeeded because he paid attention carefully while everyone else relied on force. History often remembers conquerors only for violence. Yet one of Alexander's most famous moments came from understanding fear, rather than overpowering it. Of course, history also remembers what happened afterward. The endless campaigns, the burned cities, the shattered empires, and the terrifying ambition that pushed Alexander farther east, until even his exhausted soldiers finally refused to continue. So perhaps Philip was right when he looked at his son after the ride and realized Macedon was too small for him. Unfortunately for the rest of the ancient world, Alexander agreed completely, and somewhere inside all those future victories and disasters still lived the memory of a boy riding a once untamable horse across a dusty Macedonian field while history quietly began paying attention.